You walk into a pawn shop carrying a guitar you know could probably sell for around $500. The employee checks the brand, looks at the model number, turns it over to inspect the condition, pulls up a few recent prices, and then gives you an offer, $250. Your first reaction is obvious. If this thing is worth $500, why are they only willing to give you half? It feels like the answer must be simple. You need cash quickly, they know it, and the gap between $500 and $250 is where they plan to make their money. But the pawnbroker is not really asking what your guitar is worth to you, or even the highest price somebody somewhere might eventually pay for it. They are asking a much more important question. If you never come back for this guitar, how much money can it reliably become? That question explains almost the entire pawn shop business. From the outside, a pawn shop looks like several businesses that should not fit together. There is a lending counter beside a jewelry case, used power tools hanging beside game consoles, guitars above televisions, watches beside lawn equipment, and customers walking through the same door for completely different reasons. One person needs cash. Another wants to sell an old chain. Another is hunting for a discounted laptop. It can look like a bank, a thrift store, a jewelry dealer, and a garage sale compressed into one small storefront, but those pieces are not randomly sharing rent. They are connected by one skill, deciding what used objects can reliably be turned back into cash. Start with the loan, because it works very differently from most forms of consumer credit. You hand the shop an item of personal property. The pawnbroker determines how much they are willing to advance against it, and the shop physically keeps that item while the loan is outstanding. If you repay the principal plus the applicable pawn charges within the allowed period, you take the item home. If you decide not to repay, the collateral can eventually become merchandise for the store. First Cash, one of the world's largest pawn operators, describes these loans as non-recourse. The pledged property is the security, the company does not perform normal debt collection on the pawn loan, and the customer has no legal obligation to repay in the same way they would on an unsecured loan. That sounds almost too good for the shop. If you repay, they get the principal back plus a fee. If you do not repay, they get the guitar. So it is tempting to say the pawn shop wins either way. But that explanation skips the most important part of the transaction, because receiving collateral is only useful if the collateral is worth more than the amount of money already advanced against it. If the shop lends $450 against a guitar it believes is worth $500, then discovers that buyers will only pay $400. Having possession of the guitar did not magically protect the business. The shop still made a bad decision. The collateral does not eliminate risk. It changes where the risk lives. That is why the $250 offer matters. The shop needs a gap between what it believes the guitar can realistically sell for and what it is willing to lend today. First Cash says its loan amounts are primarily based on a percentage of the estimated retail value of the collateral, and its employees use information including recent selling prices inside their own network, precious metals markets, online marketplaces, auction sites, advertisements, physical inspection, and employee experience to estimate that value. The pawnbroker is therefore not merely choosing a price. They are building a margin of safety around an uncertain future sale. Imagine the guitar can probably sell for $500, but probably is doing a lot of work. Maybe it sits for 2 months before anyone wants it. Maybe a customer negotiates the price down to $450. Maybe the electronics are intermittent. Maybe the strings need replacing. Maybe a newer version pushes used prices lower. Maybe the $500 listings online are asking prices rather than actual selling prices. The customer can look at the best comparable listing and say, "My guitar is worth $500." And the shop has to ask something harsher. What amount am I confident I can recover after the uncertainty, the waiting, the operating expense, and the possibility that my appraisal is wrong? That is the governing number in this business, not the sticker price and not even the fee by itself. It is the gap between the item's expected resale value and the amount the shop is willing to risk against it. A wider gap gives the pawnbroker more room to survive a bad estimate. A narrower gap may make the loan more attractive to the customer, but it gives the store less protection if the item ends up becoming inventory. The pawnbroker is trying to be accurate about value while leaving enough room to survive being inaccurate. And now the strange layout of the store begins to make sense, because the lending business and the retail business are not separate operations. They are two possible endings to the same appraisal. If the customer returns, the item never becomes retail merchandise. The store gets its principal back and earns the pawn charge for providing temporary cash. If the customer does not return, the principal amount effectively becomes the store's cost basis in the forfeited item. And that item enters the merchandise system where the shop tries to recover the money through a sale. First Cash says forfeited collateral is transferred into inventory at the amount of the unpaid pawn principal, and that it typically recovers that principal through merchandise sales at prices above the carrying value. One decision at the counter therefore creates two exits. The first exit is financial. Cash goes out, principal comes back, and the shop earns pawn fees. The second exit is retail. Cash goes out, the customer does not redeem, and the physical object becomes inventory that can be sold. The business does not need to know with certainty which exit will happen when the loan is made. It needs the original valuation to be conservative enough that either outcome can be economically workable. This is also why it would be a mistake to think pawn shops are secretly hoping everyone abandons their property. Redeemed loans are valuable because the principal comes back without the store having to find a retail buyer for the collateral, and major operators explicitly track redemption behavior as part of running the business. Ease Corp describes the success of its pawn operation as heavily dependent on accurately assessing both the probability that a pawn will be redeemed and the estimated resale or scrap value of the collateral. The shop does not need the customer to lose the guitar. It needs to have priced the transaction correctly, whichever decision the customer eventually makes. There is one more outcome hidden inside the redemption side of the business, and it may be even more valuable than a single successful loan. The customer can come back, repay the $250 plus the pawn charge, take the guitar home, and then return weeks or months later with the exact same guitar when another cash shortage appears. From the shop's perspective, the collateral is no longer completely unfamiliar. They have seen the instrument before. They know roughly how it was valued. They know whether the customer redeemed the previous loan, and the same physical asset can support another fee-producing transaction without ever becoming permanent inventory. That changes the economics of a redeemed pawn. The first loan does not necessarily end when the guitar goes home. It can become the beginning of a repeat relationship. The customer still owns the asset, but every time they temporarily need access to part of its value, the pawn shop has another opportunity to advance cash against it and collect another pawn charge when it is redeemed. In other words, the shop does not need the guitar to end up on the wall to keep earning from it. A well-understood piece of collateral can move back and forth across the same counter repeatedly, generating fees while ownership stays with the customer. That gives the pawn shop something even more valuable than a profitable forfeiture: a customer who gets their property back, but may eventually need to unlock its value again. Before we go deeper, think about what you would actually pawn if you suddenly needed $300 by tonight. Not what you would happily sell, but what you own that has enough value to produce cash and enough personal value that you would still want it back. That distinction is where pawn becomes much more interesting than ordinary secondhand retail. And if you enjoy seeing everyday businesses pulled apart until the numbers underneath them become visible, liking and subscribing genuinely helps these videos reach more people. Now suppose you are behind the counter instead. A customer brings in a gold chain, another brings a nearly new power drill, another has an old laptop, a fourth has a collectible they insist is worth $3,000. The most expensive object is not automatically the best collateral, because price and liquidity are not the same thing. The pawnbroker does not merely care what something might be worth under perfect conditions. They care about how quickly and confidently it can be converted into money. That is why something ordinary can be better collateral than something rare. A common gold chain may have a smaller theoretical upside than an unusual collectible, but the shop can weigh the gold, check purity, observe a widely quoted commodity price, compare recent jewelry transactions, and, if necessary, recover value through scrap. The collectible may have a passionate buyer somewhere in the world willing to pay thousands, but if the shop cannot identify that buyer, confirm authenticity, or predict how long the item will sit, the impressive price is not especially useful. A theoretical $3,000 value with no obvious exit can be worse collateral than $700 of value that can be measured and sold with confidence. First Cash's own disclosures show how important this distinction is. As of March 31, 2026, it operated 3,034 pawn locations across the United States, Latin America, and the United Kingdom, and the average outstanding pawn loan in its U.S. segment was only about $328. In that same U.S. segment, jewelry represented 75% of pawn collateral by value. This is a huge international business built largely around relatively small transactions, which means the process of evaluating collateral cannot be an occasional specialist event. It has to happen quickly, repeatedly, and with enough consistency to work thousands of times a day. The financial statements also reveal why calling a pawn shop simply a loan company misses half the operation. In the first quarter of 2026, First Cash's U.S. pawn segment generated approximately $157.8 million in pawn loan fees and about $283.8 million in retail merchandise sales. That sounds as though merchandise is obviously the bigger business, but revenue and profit contribution are not the same thing. When a store sells a television for $400 appears as sales revenue, but the television has an inventory cost attached to it. Pawn service charges behave differently because they are revenue generated from the temporary advance itself. Ease Corp makes the structure even easier to see. During fiscal 2025, the company reported roughly $701 million in merchandise sales, $474 million in pawn service charges, and nearly $99 million in jewelry scrap sales. Merchandise therefore produced the biggest headline sales number, But the company describes pawn service charges, merchandise sales, and jewelry scrapping as distinct engines within the same pawn operation. The store is not choosing between being a lender and being a retailer. The same flow of customer property continually feeds both sides of the model. And jewelry reveals a third possible exit. Suppose the customer never redeems a gold chain. The shop can put it in the case and try to sell it as jewelry, but if the piece is unfashionable, damaged, or simply more valuable for its metal than its design, the operator may recover value by scrapping the precious metal instead. EasyCorp specifically reports jewelry scrap sales separately from ordinary merchandise sales, and in the quarter ended December 2025, it generated almost $40 million from that category alone. A useful piece of collateral is powerful partly because it has more than one path back to cash. Now think again about the guitar. The customer might ask why the shop is offering $250 when it could eventually put a $500 sticker on the instrument. But the sticker is not the shop's profit. The store has to recover the $250 already advanced, pay the employee who appraised it, pay rent on the building where it sits, fund all the other loans currently locked inside other customers' collateral, protect thousands of dollars of merchandise from theft, operate compliance systems, and wait for the right buyer. A $500 future sale is very different from $500 of guaranteed value today. Inventory also consumes space and capital while it waits. A drill sitting behind glass is money that has not yet returned. A guitar on the wall is part of a previous loan still waiting to complete its journey back into cash. A pawn shop that appraises items correctly but cannot sell forfeited merchandise efficiently can still build up shelves full of capital that is technically valuable and practically stuck. That is another reason liquidity matters so much. The best collateral is not merely something valuable. It is something whose value the store can repeatedly recognize and whose buyer it can reasonably expect to find. This creates a business model with an unusual relationship to inventory. A conventional retailer chooses products from manufacturers and wholesalers, orders them in planned quantities, and tries to sell those products to customers. A pawnshop receives much of its merchandise from the same local population that buys from it. First Cash says its pawn stores generate retail inventory primarily from collateral forfeitures and direct over-the-counter purchases from customers, while EasyCorp says it also sells merchandise acquired through unredeemed pawns and purchases from the public. The people walking through the door are not only borrowers and shoppers, they are also part of the supply chain. That changes what a good pawn shop employee actually does. They are not simply a cashier making low offers all day. They are performing dozens of miniature underwriting decisions on physical objects. Is this watch real? Is this phone locked? Is this drill a model customers around here actually buy? Is this chain 14 karat or 10 karat? Is the guitar worth 500 in this market? Or only on an optimistic listing that has been sitting online for 6 months? Every answer affects how much cash can safely leave the store. Technology helps, but it does not remove the judgment. First Cash says its networked store systems allow employees to reference selling information and enable management to monitor merchandise sales, pawn loan fees, loans written and redeemed, and inventory changes across the operation. A large pawn chain, therefore, has something an independent customer does not: a history of thousands or millions of previous transactions showing what similar objects actually turned into when somebody tried to sell them. That data advantage explains why the customer's idea of value and the store's idea of value can diverge even when nobody is lying. The customer remembers what the item cost new, what a similar one is listed for online, or what it means personally. The pawnbroker is trying to estimate a recoverable value under imperfect conditions. A wedding ring can be priceless to the person who owns it and still be evaluated by metal weight, stone quality, and resale demand at the counter. A guitar can represent 10 years of memories to the musician and still be an inventory unit to the shop. And this is where the simple story about desperate customers being lowballed becomes incomplete. The customer may accept $250 against a $500 guitar because they do not actually want to sell a $500 guitar. They want $250 today and the possibility of owning the guitar again later. A direct sale could generate more cash, but it would permanently transfer ownership immediately. The pawn loan gives the customer temporary liquidity while preserving a path back to the asset. That feature is especially important because a pawn loan does not depend on the same promise structure as ordinary unsecured credit. First Cash says it relies primarily on the marketability and expected sales value of the pledged goods rather than third-party credit reporting. And because its pawn loans are non-recourse, its pawn stores do not pursue debt collection if the customer chooses not to repay. The borrower has two choices: repay the money and get the item back, or walk away and let the shop keep it. But that flexibility for the borrower exists because the shop protected itself before the cash ever left the counter. If the pawnbroker advanced the full expected value of every object, the non-recourse structure would become dangerous very quickly. The store can allow the customer to walk away because the appraisal and loan amount were designed around the possibility that walking away might happen. This is also where the biggest operational risk becomes visible. Imagine the employee thinks a laptop can reliably sell for $800 and advances $500. The borrower does not redeem it, so the laptop becomes inventory. Then a new model launches, used prices collapse, and the store discovers buyers will only pay $450. The problem was not that the borrower failed to repay. That outcome was already built into the structure. The problem was that the original valuation was wrong. The same risk appears if an item is counterfeit, damaged internally, stolen, unusually difficult to resell, or simply unpopular in that local market. A pawnshop can hold collateral against every loan and still make bad loans if it consistently misjudges what that collateral can become. First Cash explicitly says the pledged collateral is the only security for its pawn loans, and its accounting treatment relies on the fair value of that collateral being significantly above the principal advanced. The protection therefore comes from the appraisal, not from the physical fact that something is sitting in the back room. Now scale that across thousands of stores. First Cash reported more than $441 million in outstanding U.S. pawn loans at March 31, 2026, alongside more than $311 million of U.S. pawn inventory. Those numbers represent an enormous collection of individual decisions about rings, televisions, tools, phones, guitars, and other objects, each of which began with somebody behind a counter answering roughly the same question. How much of this item's value am I willing to believe? That is why the $500 guitar never really had one value. To the owner, it might be worth $500 because that is what similar guitars appear to sell for, or it might be worth far more because they love it and intend to get it back. To a future retail customer, it may be worth $475. To the pawn shop, however, the important value is the amount of money it can safely advance today while preserving enough room for uncertainty tomorrow. The customer sees the gap between $500 and $250 and thinks that is where the shop's profit is hiding. In reality, the gap has to do much more work than that. It protects against bad appraisals, discounts, slow inventory, changing markets, and the cost of turning a used object back into cash. If the borrower redeems, the shop earns the pawn charge and never has to test its resale estimate. If the borrower does not redeem, the appraisal finally gets tested in the retail market. So a pawn shop does not really make its money when somebody fails to reclaim a guitar, and it does not really make its money when another customer later buys that guitar from the wall. By then, the most important decision has already happened. The business was shaped minutes after the original customer walked through the door, when the employee looked at something that might sell for $500 and decided how much of that $500 they were willing to risk. That is the hidden economics of the pawn shop. It is a lender whose loans can turn into inventory, a retailer whose customers partly supply its shelves, and an appraisal operation that has to turn uncertain objects into conservative numbers quickly enough to repeat the process all day. The loan fee matters, the retail markup matters, the scrap value matters, but all three sit downstream from the same decision. The $500 price was never the most important number. The $250 offer was, because a pawn shop does not really make its money when it sells your stuff. It makes its money when it decides what your stuff is worth, and lends less. If you enjoyed pulling this business apart, liking and subscribing helps more than you might think. And if you want to see another storefront solving the same "I need cash now" problem with a completely different kind of bet, watch the payday loan video next. A payday lender is looking toward the paycheck you have not received yet. A pawnbroker is looking at the object you already own. See you in the next one.